Hey guys, today I want to talk about the science of learning and how it applies to music production. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need to do is to understand how the brain works and how we take information and we store it in our short-term and then eventually our long-term memory. Okay, so first of all, what is a memory? A memory is a web of connections between nerves in your brain. And we get strong connections and weak connections, and we lose these connections, we grow these connections, and this is kind of a process you might have heard about called neuroplasticity. Okay, so how do we form these connections? So let me just quickly give you a very brief overview of the entire process from hearing some information or seeing information to storing it in your long-term memory and basically learning it forever. Okay, so the first stage is something called sensory input. So we either see something, we hear something, or we experience something. And that goes into our sensory memory. So from sensory input into sensory memory. Then one of two things happens. It either gets stored in your short-term memory, so it goes to your short-term memory, or it gets flushed. Okay, and the difference between it getting flushed from your sensory memory or getting moved into your short-term memory is attention. You have to pay attention. So just to give an example, imagine you're walking down the street and you see a newspaper stand and you see like 10 different newspapers and you read very briefly a bunch of headlines and none of them are meaningful to you. You're not really paying attention, maybe listening to music or you're chatting to somebody and your eyes are kind of just glancing over them. That's when this information just gets flushed, and this is happening probably millions of times throughout the day. It's just impossible for us to take in everything around us. It would be a very uncomfortable life, I think. Okay, so we know we have to be paying attention for this information to go into our short-term memory. Okay, but from our short-term memory, it can still be lost. This information can still get pruned very quickly. And so how do we keep it in our short-term memory long enough for it to then move into our long-term memory? This process is called rehearsal. So we have to repeat this information over and over again in our heads. Let's use an example of, say, learning about compression. So you're on YouTube and you've just watched a video on compressors and how all the parameters on a compressor work. So the instructor on YouTube tells you the attack on a compressor, if you make it longer, is going to make your transients come out more in the music. Well, you paid attention to what he said, and now you're kind of repeating it, and you're trying to make sense of it in your head. So you're repeating this information over again in your head. The attack, if I make it longer, the transients come out more in the music. Okay, so you're repeating it, and now it's in your short-term memory. So the goal from there is to move it from your short-term memory into the long-term memory. And this process is called transfer. So how do we transfer information into our long-term memory? Well, transfer only really happens when the information that is in our short-term memory has some significance or it's important to us. So this could be in the form of like a strong emotional response. So think about fear, like if you get chased by a dog or something, that's not something you're likely to forget 10 minutes later. Or love and attraction, maybe you see a girl or a boy that you're really attracted to, you're most likely also not going to forget about them in 10 minutes. But what happens if there is no strong emotional response and, for example, you're learning, I don't know, a friend's phone number or how a compressor works? You know, it's really just dials and numbers. It's pretty boring. There's no strong emotional response. Well, in this case, you need to attach this memory to a pre-existing long-term memory. So in the example of learning a friend's phone number, I'm sure most of you have learned at least a phone number in your life. Usually when you recall this memory, you're imagining maybe the friend's house that you've been in, or you're seeing their face, or maybe you have a smell in your memory or something that you've made this connection to. It could be seeing a color, maybe a color that they were wearing on a certain day or something. That's how you kind of make the connection. Okay, and then in the case of music production, let's say you've just learned about this compressor on YouTube and now you need to store this information. You need to transfer it into your long-term memory. What you'll need to do is you need to take this information that you've used and apply it practically to your own music. You need to make that connection so that you can hear and get some sort of emotional response or make some sort of important important connection between how the compressor is affecting your music and what it's done to improve it. So taking that compressor and say putting it onto your drums and opening up that attack and bringing down the threshold, and then like hearing the transients pop out of the music, that connection now that you've made is going to be what stores it in your long-term memory. If you've just heard about a compressor and what the attack is doing, but never actually truly felt it and experienced it firsthand, chances are you're probably not going to wake up the next day and be able to repeat to somebody else exactly what the compressor is doing. You really need to understand it. Okay, so once that information has then gone into your long-term memory, it again can get lost. You can flush it. It'll be there for longer, but you can still lose that information. So to keep it there, we have to practice something called retrieval. So retrieval is when you go in and you fetch a memory and you kind of repeat it or you practice it. And so an example of retrieval would be, let's say now we have gone in and we've used the compressor, we understand how it works, we've heard what it's doing to our music. We then go to sleep and we wake up the next day. The next day we should then open up that compressor and use it again, or maybe explain how the compressor works to a friend, explain it to them and then show it to them so that they can hear it. And this process, you kind of need to have breaks between doing it. If you've ever heard about the science of practice and learning, like say an instrument or a language, we know that, for example, if you're say learning the piano and you want to practice and learn a piece, say a musical piece, you can either sit there and practice it for 2 hours, or a lot more effective way of doing this would be to practice the piece for 1 hour and then go to sleep and wake up and practice again for 1 hour. These breaks between periods of retrieval are super important for strengthening those memories and those synapses. Okay, so taking all this information that we've just learned, we can basically conclude that the most important thing for improving and learning music production is to, one, be very practical. So don't just sit there on YouTube all day and watch tutorials. You have to go in and you have to practice. And it's important to be very consistent. So you have to have regular periods of practice with breaks between. So ideally practicing every day and having good sleep at night is what you need to really improve quickly. Okay, so I hope that was explained fairly well. I'm not a neuroscientist or a scientist of any sort. I just like to read about these sort of things and then regurgitate the information so that I remember it. I hope you enjoyed that and you can take this away and apply it in your own life. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.